Welcome back, heathens, to the spookiest time of year that was never actually intended to be spooky. Many of you know this as Halloween, but to the ancient pagans, this time of year was known as Samhain. Welcome to Storytime Castle. I am, of course, and your host, Castle, aka the real Slim Yeezus. Let's get right into the video. I almost sounded like fucking what's his name there, Keemstar. Did not mean for that to happen. I almost, God, and no swearing.
Let's get right
into the news. So, Samhain, what is it? I'm sure many of you, if you follow me, have heard of Samhain, but what exactly is Samhain? Now, Samhain is seen from many different scopes as it was celebrated by several different pagan cultures. It was celebrated in some form by the Vikings. And I want to make an important note, because a lot of people don't seem to know this, that the Vikings were not one generalized group of people. Vikings is a historical term referring to native tribes of areas like Iceland, Sweden, and Norway. They were not usually in any way associated with each other and were usually very small groups. Now, the other groups that celebrated this were the Celts, the Manx, and the Gaels. The predominant origin of this holiday is Gaelic and Celtic. Now, it originated in Ireland and Wales, stretching back pretty much as far as the 1st century, but the first real notes we have on it start in the 9th and 11th century. And that is when it gained the name Samhain. Before that, it was known as Evering, and before that, it was known as Dunsta. Now, we're not going to talk really about Dunsta or Evering because they are a much broader concept. We're going to talk about the more modern aspect, which is, of course, Samhain. Now, Samhain is a feast festival. There are 4 feast festivals throughout the year. They are meant to align with harvest festivals. And the way that this one is typically seen is that it is a feast and harvest festival that is meant to more or less protect people and to bless the end of harvest and send sacrifices to the gods. Now, that is a much more modern, post-Catholic aspect of these things. Now, keep in mind that the pagans started being influenced by the Catholics, and it's, again, important to note that we say Catholics, not Christians, because the Christians didn't come around until some 5 or 6 centuries later. The Catholics, however, the Catholic Church started around the year, year 2? Year 4? Year 5? I don't know. In the 1st century was when the Catholic Church rolled around, and Christians didn't come around until sometime later, at the behest of people like Martin Luther. Not Martin Luther King Jr., that's an entirely different man, fought for civil rights. Martin Luther was a German who resisted the Catholic Church and who would eventually accidentally form a religion or a religious sect known as Lutherans. Now, back to Samhain. Now, the big question that a lot of you had, what sort of activities went on during Samhain? Now, there are a plethora of myths and stories and tales behind what was done during Samhain. Now, to cover them all, this video would have to be incredibly long, and if you guys are interested in more of the specific traditions of Samhain, there's a ton. There is a frick ton of these stories and mythologies and practices, but we're going to go into the most prominent ones. But if you guys want to know more, I can do an entire video or video series, because it might have to be 2 or 3, because we're trying to keep these around 10 minutes. If you want to know more, please let me know in the comments, and I will do my best to make another video around these traditions. Now, that being said, one of the greatest things about Samhain is the festival. So the festival around Samhain is basically a feast festival. And now, back in the olden days, in the days of the Druids, we're talking about probably the 9th to 12th centuries, the Druids would sacrifice a cow or a sheep and then burn their entrails in braziers. Now, braziers are giant, essentially bowls of flame. They're old school fire pits. The fire pit of the pagan. It's essentially what rednecks would sit around and drink beer, only back then it was mead and they were eating pretty much raw, unsalted meat. Now, what they would do is they would cut open these beasts in a very ceremonial manner, hanging them from their feet, bleeding them into bowls, and then taking out all of the internal organs. The blood would be burned first, then the organs, and then the rest of the animal would be burned afterwards, and then another animal would be butchered for the feast. Now, this was later determined to be very wasteful in about the 15th and 16th centuries when famine was very common. So it just became the blood and entrails that were burned, and the rest of the beast was cooked for the Samhain feast. Now, in addition to that, different crops and things in the regular tradition, like you see in Belton and in Bulk, people would take bowls of food and different trinkets, leave them at the edges of the woods, set them on windowsills, and hang them from doorways as sacrifice for the Aoshi, or what we would refer to today as Fae. Now, I want to do an entire video on the Aoshi because it's another thing that's very commonly misunderstood, but Aoshi is what we refer to as Fae or fairies. That's not entirely correct. The Aoshi are actually a name that developed much after the Catholics started influencing the pagans of Ireland and Wales and Scotland and other Mid and Eastern Europe places. Aoshi is how they referred to the gods. So it's a little bit of a misnomer to call Fae Aoshi or even Shi in general, but we'll talk about that in another video. For now, one of the fears is that because the veil is so thin, much greater Fae, much greater Aoshi could come through and could steal things, could steal children. Changelings, Banshee, and Dullahan were some of the major ones that people worried about during this time, because nobody wanted to die. And the Catholics, who are obsessed with dying, brought that fear in plethora to the pagans, because the pagans had many more superstitions as far as the things that exist in the world. By this time, most Catholics had reduced their superstitions down to only a few dozen, whereas the pagans and the heathens of the time, they had a much more plethoric understanding of the world. So there was much more to be afraid of when they started having this fear and understanding of death. Now, there were many things that were done to keep the gods and the Aoshi at bay, again, leaving sacrifices at the edge of the forest to keep Cernunnos and the Green Man from sending their different fae to kidnap children. That's where the changeling aspect comes from. A much less known tale about Cernunnos and the Green Man is that they were the creators and holders of the changelings. Now, the changelings were responsible for taking children and bringing them into the forest, and then Cernunnos and the forest would actually feed off the energy of the children. And it was much feared during this time that Cernunnos was empowered, because it's the end of festival, it's getting cold, and this was a time when he could harvest more energy because people would still be out, but they would not be as on guard because it's cold, we're bundled up. So these fears were very plethoric. So what would happen is they would leave bowls and plates of food or baskets of food on the edges of the forest to distract the changelings and Cernunnos from coming to take away their children. Now, the sacrifices where they would burn the entrails and burn the blood inside of the braziers, this was done to satiate the gods. This was done to say thank you to the gods such as Cernunnos, and in Viking culture it would have been Freya and possibly Balder, and then in Gaelic and Celtic culture it would have been Cernunnos and the Morrigan, as these were harvest gods and goddesses. Now, here's one thing that is less practiced, but in mine and my brother's clan that is still commonly practiced, is referred to as the Feast of the Ancestors. Now, Evering translates to, literally it's the sound of bells, but in the language it translates to Ballad of the Bells or Feast of the Ancestors. It can be translated two ways, whether you're talking about Scottish Gaelic or Irish Gaelic and the spelling. So what is believed is that during this time, the ancestors cross over the veil. And our ancestors, we believe that our ancestors are the gods. They are not these supernatural beings. They are just greater, stronger versions of us before the world became weak. And during this time, they cross over because this is technically Pagan New Year. So the year doesn't begin when things start to get better. The year begins as everything dies, and then rebirth happens in the middle of the year. They split things up a little bit more consciously back then, but we'll talk about that again in another video. So the Feast of the Ancestors is where the ancestors come back and they sit with us. They sit and they dine with their family, with their kin. We tell them the new stories so that they can hold them, so that they can remember them, and they reinvigorate the old tales within their family, within their kin. And this is a really, really important tradition that has more or less been lost to the general practice of neo-pagans and Wiccans, because it is not something that is widely or commonly practiced, because it was very, very quickly stuffed out by the British Empire and by the Catholic Church, because the idea of eating with the dead is something that is very much in the line of necromancy, and necromancy is very much frowned upon in pre-Christian and post-Christian religions. Everything from Islam to Buddhism to Christianity and Catholicism, the idea of eating or communing with the dead is much a taboo. This is why things like seances and Ouija boards are very, very much disavowed by any sort of formal organized religion. But in ancient pagan culture, it was a beautiful time when we sat and told stories, and it was all about the stories. And that's one of the things I love about Celtic mythology and Gaelic mythology, is that it's more based around the stories and the people than it is around the miraculous power of the gods. It wasn't meant to be these things that were meant to marvel people. They were just supposed to be stories of what happened. And that's why when you get a lot of Celtic and Gaelic mythology, there's not a lot of precursor and pretense to these stories. They're just told. It's not like in Asian mythologies where you have this build-up and there's always a moral to the story. No, sometimes things just happen. And that's one of the beautiful things about Gaelic and Celtic mythology. And that's not to say that other mythologies are lesser because of the way that they act. They're very important to storytelling. It's one of the unique and beautiful things about Gaelic and Celtic mythology and culture, is that it was not based around being better than other things or having something exemplified. It was just about the stories. And Samhain has always been a time when we are supposed to tell stories. We sit with our friends, we sit with our families, and we tell stories. And that's why it's one of the most beautiful holidays for me, and it's one of the ones that is most treasured by our family. And I really hope that you guys will join us in Discord and on Twitter and on Instagram and even on TikTok for the videos that I'll be putting out talking about these things, because it's really is one of the most beautiful holidays of the year. So not much of this survives today, but some of the traditions that we still practice today, many of you have asked me about, so I thought I'd bring them to light. Now, the object of trick-or-treating is one that goes back a very, very long time. As it's done today, that started, I believe, in the 13th or 14th century, where children would go door to door in masks to scare off the Fae, and again to scare off the changelings. It would make the goblins believe that they were one of them, so that they would not steal or kidnap them, and it would scare off the changelings. The changelings would assume that they were goblins or greater fairies, and they would be scared away. And the children were rewarded for doing this by the local neighbors by being given bread and cheese and, in the times when they had them, sweets. Now, sweets are another thing. Like, pagan food is something I want to do videos on, but sweets were something that existed a long time back by solidifying honey or even soaking honeycomb in honey and then chewing on the wax. Like, sweets have existed for a very long time. It's not such a new concept to have things like candy. They were just much different, 500, 600, 700 years ago. What that tradition is founded in is something that happened much, much before, with great billowing fires to scare off hobgoblins. Now, hobgoblins are something I want to do an entire video on, because they actually have presence in The Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter, and all other forms of popular media, and they are a fascinating creature. So I do want to do videos on those, but for now, we will just say that children would go from house to house and receive bread and clothing from the different neighbors, and then they would return it after the holiday was over, so that they could trick the hobgoblins and the changelings into believing that they too were fellow goblins. Now, one of the things that has evolved over time is obviously a lot of people carve pumpkins, and these pumpkins are sort of meant to be scary. Now, this originates in an old Gaelic and Manx tradition where they would carve faces into turnips, and these faces were meant to distract Cernunnos. Now, They were carved, and then they would have candles put inside of them, candles or fire put inside of them, and they'd be placed at the edges of forests. And these were meant to confuse Cernunnos into thinking that they were either children or other fae, and set him off from going into the villages. And that evolved over time and became a very fun tradition that's more about spooky pumpkins than it is about actually scaring off any old world pagan gods. To some, Samhain is just Halloween, and it's where we go around and we get candy and we scare each other, we drink, we are in merriment, and that is very much in the spirit of what the holiday is supposed to be. Just be safe, be responsible, and be respectful to those around you. That's really all you need to do. And if you do enjoy the traditions of me and my family and our clan, you're more than welcome to join us here with a subscription. And if you want to be notified when I put up videos, because YouTube is awful at that, you can hit the bell button and you'll be notified every time I upload. And if you did enjoy, I would be absolutely flattered if you left a like. And if you want to know more about these subjects, you can always leave a comment or join the discussion on Twitter, Instagram, Discord, or even in the comments down below. But for now, have a happy Halloween, have a wonderful Samhain, have a merry Evering. Don't forget to say hello to your granddad. And I will see you all in the next video. Cheers, kids. I love you. Be safe.